In 2003, a software bug killed a patient. Panama's National Oncology Institute was using a radiation treatment planning system called multidata. The software calculated the dose of radiation a patient should receive during therapy. It had been tested. It had been approved. It was working correctly for the vast majority of cases. But there was a configuration, a specific arrangement of radiation shielding blocks that oncologists drew directly into the software that the system misinterpreted. When technicians drew the blocks in a particular way, the software calculated a safe dose, but it was calculating for the wrong configuration. The actual dose being delivered was between 3 and 5 times higher than what the patient's body could survive. 17 patients were overdosed. 8 of them died. The software had a known limitation. It was documented in the manual. The people who built it weren't careless. The people who tested it weren't negligent. But somewhere between this works in the cases we tested and this works for every real patient in every real clinical situation, there was a gap. People fell into it. That gap between a passing test suite and the real human safety is what this episode is about. Before we go further, I want to talk about the words we use because I think they are part of the problem. In software testing, we have a vocabulary that is specifically designed to be neutral, clinical, and even manageable, such as low severity, edge case, known limitation, or acceptable risk, or even won't fix, workaround available. These phrases are extremely useful. They help teams to communicate quickly and make decisions at scale, but they also do something else. They create a distance between the language of the bug report and the reality of what a bug does to a person. Take known limitation. It sounds almost respectable. It sounds like a responsible, documented design boundary. But let's translate it into plain language for a moment. In Panama case, the known limitation was this. If an operator drew the radiation shielding blocks in a specific way, the software would silently calculate the wrong dose. The system wouldn't warn you. It wouldn't fail visibly. It would just give you a number, a confident, precise, and, well, completely wrong number, and you would have no way of knowing. That is not a limitation. That is a trap with a manual page. Now, take low severity cosmetic issue. This one is my personal favorite in the worst possible way. Cosmetic. The word we use for things that don't really matter, things that look a bit off but don't affect functionality. Picture this. A government benefits form has a field where applicants enter their name. The field has a character validation bug, silently strips out hyphens and apostrophes on submission, such as no error message, no warning, and the form appears to submit successfully. The applicant gets a confirmation email, they go home thinking they are done, but on the other end, the system has stored a name that doesn't match their ID document. The caseworker sees a discrepancy. The application is flagged, or, well, rejected, or it just sits in a queue forever, waiting for a manual review that, well, never comes. The applicant doesn't know any of this. They are just waiting, wondering why nobody has contacted them. Maybe they are reapplying, maybe giving up. A cosmetic issue, a name field that doesn't accept hyphens. The language doesn't make us bad people, but it can make us comfortable with things we shouldn't be comfortable with. And one of the most important skills a tester can develop is the ability to translate from bug report language back into human impact language, to look at the ticket and ask, if I describe this in plain English to someone who has never heard of severity levels, what did I just say? Here's the part of the multi-data story that I find most unsettling. The limitation was in the manual. The vendor had documented it. They could point to the page. In a strict legal and contractual sense, they had done their job, the information was available. So when things went wrong, the question of who was responsible became genuinely complicated. Was it the hospital for not following the manual closely enough? Was it the operators who hadn't read the specific section? Was it the software vendor for not building a safeguard? I think it's a question worth sitting with. It reveals something important about how we think about documentation as a substitute for safety. There is a pattern in software development and in testing where documenting a known problem is treated as equivalent to solving it. The risk is written down, the limitation is noted, the workaround is described, then the ticket gets closed. But documentation is only as useful as the system that ensures it reaches the right person at the right moment before a dangerous thing is happening. An oncologist drawing sheared blocks in a busy clinic is not reading the manual. They are trusting the software to stop them if something is wrong, and the software didn't. Ethical question for testers here is sharp. When you document a known limitation instead of escalating for a fix, are you solving the problem? Or are you just creating a paper trail? After the Panama's incident, there were investigations, criminal proceedings, and a great deal of debate about accountability. The software vendor pointed to the manual, the hospital pointed to the software, the operators said they were following established practice. The regulators asked why nobody has flagged the risk before patients were tested. Every one of those parties was, in some sense, right. And every one of them was also, in some sense, responsible. That's what makes this case so instructive. It's a textbook example of the gap that opens up when multiple parties each assume someone else owns a critical safety check. In software terms, this gap has a very familiar shape. The developer says, I built a specification and the specification didn't cover this edge case. The tester says, I tested the documented requirements and this scenario wasn't in the test plan. The product owner says, the vendor assumed us that the system was validated. And then the vendor says, it's in the manual. And nobody is lying. And yet, the gap between all those assumptions is exactly where harm happened. The tester's role in breaking that cycle is not to own every responsibility. It's to be the person who asks the uncomfortable question out loud, who is actually verifying that system is safe in a full range of real-world conditions, not just the documented happy path. If nobody can answer that question clearly, the answer is nobody. And nobody is not acceptable answer when a system is treating cancer patients. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying it's the tester's responsibility. What I want to highlight is that since this video is mainly about software testing, the testers have the power to ask the uncomfortable questions out loud during the development. There is one more layer in this story that deserves a mention even briefly. The multi-data system had been certified. It had been gone through regulatory approval process. That certification created a halo effect, a quiet collective assumption that the regulator had approved it, the risk had been adequately assessed, testing had been done, and experts had reviewed it. So it was safe. Regulatory approval is not the same as safe. Certification covers what was tested at a specific point in time, in a specific context, against a specific set of criteria. It does not cover every real-world configuration, every operator behavior, and even every clinical environment. A certified system can still have a dangerous edge case that nobody looked for. This is a bigger conversation than this episode can hold. The relationship between regulatory frameworks, testing responsibility, and software safety in critical systems is genuinely complex, so I will come back to it in a dedicated episode later. But for now, the short version is what was approved is a starting point for trust. So what should a tester do? And here are three things grounded in everything the multi-data case teaches us. The first, translate the documentation into safety questions. When you see a known limitation in a ticket, ask what happens if a user hits this limitation and doesn't know. If the answer is something bad, the limitation isn't documented enough. It needs a safeguard, a warning, or even a fix. The second, name the gap explicitly. If you are testing a system where multiple parties, vendor, hospital, operator, regulator, each assume someone else is responsible for a specific safety scenario, Write that gap down. I have tested X, I have not tested Y, I don't know who is responsible for that Y. That sentence in writing changes the conversation. The third, test for the confident wrong answer. The most dangerous failure mode in the multi-data case wasn't a crash or an error message. It was a system that produced a number that looked completely normal. Test for the cases where your system gives a confident output that is silently, laterally wrong. So the multi-data case is not a story about villains. There was no moment where someone decided to put patients at risk. There was a series of reasonable seeming decisions: document the limitation, rely on the manual, trust the certification, that collectively created the conditions for people to die. That is the hardest kind of failure to prevent because it doesn't look like failure in any individual step. It only looks like a failure at the end. And you are not giving to prevent every failure of this kind, but you can be the person who asks the question nobody else is asking, who is actually responsible for verifying this is safe in the real world, not just on paper. You can be the person who makes the answer to that question impossible to ignore. That is what it means to test with human cost in mind. See you in the next episode.